Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we are going to be talking about the American Revolution, causes of the Revolution. The foundations of colonial government. The American colonists enjoyed Britain's protection during the French and Indian War while paying very little of the cost. Meanwhile, they profited from trade with the British Empire. Most importantly, they cherished the political rights that they enjoyed as British subjects. When Parliament began to tax the colonists to raise revenue, they protested. Eventually, the protest turned to rebellion, and rebellion turned to war. North American colonies used the British government as the basis for their own. The British legislature was split into the House of Commons, shown here, and the House of Lords. Foundations of colonial government. The colonists believed that Great Britain enjoyed the best government on earth. British liberty included due process of common law, trial by jury, and freedom of the press from censorship. Above all, the colonists cherished the right to pay no tax unless it was levied by their representatives. Colonial governments followed the British model, but colonist protests during the 1760s revealed that there were some important differences. Okay, here's a chart that shows the difference between the two governments. So in Great Britain, under the king inherited that executive power and was unable to veto laws passed by Parliament. In Parliament, the House of Lords were aristocrats with inherited titles, and they also inherited legislative power. So if your father was in the House of Lords and you were his firstborn son, you were going to serve in the House of Lords. And they had the power to veto laws. Now in the Parliament at this time, they also had the House of Commons, which was elected by men who held significant amounts of property, and less than 1/4 of British men were qualified to vote and had to approve all legislation. Now if we go over to the American colonies, we have the governor, who was appointed by and served the king but paid by the colonial legislature, and was able to veto laws passed by council and assembly. Now what are council and assembly? Well, those are the colonial legislatures. This was the upper house or council, which was appointed by the governor. It was prominent colonists but without inherited titles, and served as advisors to the governor. There was also the lower house or assembly. This was elected by men who held property. About 2/3 of colonial men were qualified to vote, and they represented citizens of towns and counties and originated all tax and budget bills. So while the government in the colonies was different, it had the same structure as British government. British government serves as an example. The British government had 3 branches. Executive power belonged to the monarch. Legislative power was divided between 2 houses of parliament, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Aristocrats inherited seats in the House of Lords. Only officials in the House of Commons were elected, and only a small percentage of the people could vote. Similarly, each colony except Pennsylvania had a 2-house legislature, an elected assembly, and a council of prominent colonists appointed to life terms by the governor. Colonial governors were appointed by, represented, and served the king. Only Connecticut and Rhode Island elected their own governors, while Pennsylvania's entire assembly was elected. The colonists did not elect any members of British Parliament. By modern standards, the British system was far from democratic. To those in power, democracy seemed dangerous in a society where people inherited wildly unequal property and status. In 1770, the British Prime Minister Lord North insisted, "I can never acquiesce in the absurd opinion that all men are equal." So he's saying right there, he cannot even fathom the idea of thinking that all people are equal. So kind of shows what kind of guy he is. Most Britons and colonists agreed, and wealthy men controlled government in the colonies as in Great Britain. Different ideas about representation. Despite similarities, colonial politics differed from the British model in several ways. The British Constitution was not a formal document but a collection of laws and traditions accumulated over centuries. In contrast, the colonists' rights had traditionally been spelled out in formal legal documents such as the Royal Charters of Maryland or South Carolina, as well as informal written agreements like the Mayflower Compact. In addition, 2/3 of free colonial men owned enough property to qualify to vote, compared to less than 1/4 of British men. By 1760, political upheaval in Great Britain and European wars had enabled the elected colonial assemblies to increase their powers at the expense of the royal governors. Since the colonies lacked aristocrats with inherited titles, most leaders in the assembly and council were wealthy planters and merchants related by blood or marriage. The assemblies often withheld salaries from unpopular governors. So, you can see there are different ideas about who should be represented in government. British officials hoped to change the situation by taxing the colonists to provide salaries to royal governors and judges. Crown salaries would make them less responsive to the assemblies and councils, but that prospect alarmed the colonists, who began to recognize their deviation from Britain as an important advantage. Members of Parliament believed that they virtually represented every British subject, including the colonists. While Parliament expected the colonists to obey, the colonists saw themselves as equal members of the British political body. Since the late 1600s, England had followed a policy of salutary neglect, allowing its colonies local self-rule. So when Parliament tried to levy taxes on the colonies, they objected. The colonists believed that only their own elected officials had that right. So we're seeing a difference of opinions that is really going to start stressing things. The 7 Years' War, called the French and Indian War in the colonies, nearly doubled Britain's national debt and greatly expanded its colonial territories. Parliament needed to raise money both to pay the debt and to protect the colonies. People in Britain paid far more taxes than the colonists did. This imbalance seemed unfair, for the war had been fought largely to protect the colonists. Parliament decided that the colonists could and should pay more to help the empire. So these new taxes are going to start causing conflict. King George III of England ruled for almost 60 years. During his reign, he witnessed the British defeat of the French in the French and Indian War and experienced the loss of British colonies in North America. The Sugar, Quartering, and Stamp Acts. Colonial merchants had grown rich from trade, often smuggling or bribing officials to avoid duties or taxes on imports. In 1764, the new Prime Minister George Grenville proposed raising money by collecting duties already in effect. The law, known as the Sugar Act when put into effect, actually lowered the duty on foreign molasses. However, it also assigned customs officers and created courts to collect the duties and prosecute smugglers. So these were already technically legal, but they just weren't really being enforced, and there was nothing that was stopping smugglers. Grenville hoped that these measures would encourage colonists to pay the tax. In early 1765, Parliament passed another unpopular law, the Quartering Act. This act required the colonies to provide housing and supplies for British troops stationed there after the French and Indian War. Colonists complained, but most went along with the changes because they accepted Parliament's right to regulate trade and provide for defense. The Stamp Act. In March 1765, Parliament passed a bill intended to raise money from the colonies. The Stamp Act required colonists to pay a tax on almost all printed materials, including newspapers, books, court documents, contracts, and land deeds. This was the first time that Parliament had imposed a direct tax within the colonies. So this is the first time that they are going to directly tax the colonies. Now they're trying to regain their money to recoup their losses from the French and Indian War. It was a very expensive war, and Britain was already very low on money to begin with. So this is them trying to get some money back, and they're looking at the colonists and expecting the colonists to pay. Taxation without representation. The colonists angrily protested the Stamp Act, which was to take effect in November. They claimed that it threatened their prosperity and liberty. Colonial leaders questioned Parliament's right to tax the colonies directly. They argued that the colonies had no representation in Parliament, so Parliament had no right to tax them. Some colonists believed that if they accepted this tax, Parliament would add even more taxes, stripping away their property and political rights. Many colonists thought that the stamp tax revealed a conspiracy by British officials to destroy American liberties. The colonists' arguments puzzled the members of Parliament. After all, most Britons paid taxes, although they could not vote. Many large British cities did not elect representatives to Parliament, which claimed to represent everyone in the empire. Parliament dismissed the colonial opposition as selfish and narrow-minded. The empire needed money, and Parliament had the right to levy taxes anywhere in the empire. Of course, Parliament's argument did not sway the colonists, who were appalled to discover that the British were denying their right to tax themselves. Okay guys, that's going to be it for this video. If you have any questions about anything, you know how to get a hold of me. I hope everybody's having a great day, and I'll see you again real soon.